In the evening, when she returned home, the stairwell smelled of smoke and dust, as if someone had recently set fire to a newspaper. The light bulb on the ceiling flickered, casting long shadows. She closed the door, took off her coat, and glanced at the mirror in the hallway out of habit. A crack ran across the glass, dividing her face into two unequal parts. One half was calm, the other tense, as if the reflection lived by its own rules. She thought that this was how it was. If you looked at a broken mirror for a long time, the reflection seemed to get tired of obeying. The old mirror hung there for another day. Then she took it down. On the weekend, she went to the flea market, not to buy anything, but just to walk around and distract herself. At the back of the row where books were being sold, there was a large oval mirror in a heavy frame, covered with dust. The glass was cloudy, like old water, but without any chips. The seller said that it had been taken from a pre-revolutionary apartment building. The woman was surprised. The price was too cheap. But for some reason, she wanted to take the mirror. It seemed familiar, even though she had never seen it before. At home, she wiped the glass with a damp cloth and hung it in the hallway. The light in the room changed. It became softer. Even her face looked better in the reflection, calmer, as if the mirror had slightly corrected her emotions. She lingered in front of it longer than she had intended. When she turned off the light, the surface seemed to hold her reflection for a second, flickering with a faint gray glow, as if the inertia of the light remained there. A couple of days later, she noticed something strange. When she walked past, her reflection was slightly ahead of her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Reflections in old glass can play tricks if the frame is warped. But the next day it happened again. She reached out to adjust her scarf, and the movement had already ended in the mirror. She wasn't scared, but rather surprised. She decided to check it out. She put her phone next to it to record and made a few movements. Everything looked normal on the video, no lag. Then she blamed it on fatigue. Lately, she had to work longer hours, replacing a colleague who had gone on maternity leave. She came home exhausted in the evenings, and it seemed that the world was rushing ahead while she was lagging behind. But the mirror anticipations continued. Sometimes they were barely noticeable. The gaze in the reflection began to move slightly before she did. Sometimes they were more noticeable. In the mirror, she was already turning, even though her body was still standing in place. She tried not to pay attention to it, but gradually began to check the mirror every time she passed by, as if comparing how far behind reality was. After a week, the mirror began to resemble a clock. It seemed to show what would happen in a moment. If she was about to turn on the light, the reflection did it first. If she reached for a cup, the hand in the mirror was already holding it. It began to annoy her. She decided to move the mirror to another room, farther from the entrance. But as soon as she took it off the wall, she found a sticker with faded letters on the back. Kolesov Studio, St. Petersburg. Below that was the date, 1923. She was amazed at how long the object had survived without a single chip. After being moved, the mirror began to behave more calmly. Everything was normal for the first few days. But then the repetitions began. Not anticipations, but déjà vu. She saw the reflection repeating her movements with a slight delay, as if changing its logic. Sometimes it seemed that the reflection did not want to coincide, but was checking which of them was first. One night she got up to get some water and noticed that the light from the hallway was reflecting more strongly than it should have. It was as if the lamp there was brighter than in reality. In the mirror, the reflected room looked a little brighter and cleaner. The curtain was straighter, the books were neater, the cup was in its place, although in reality it was lying on the table. The minor inconsistencies were annoying, but they could be easily explained. Perhaps her brain was filling in the picture. The next evening, the inconsistencies became more pronounced. In the reflection, she saw herself sitting at the table, even though she was standing by the window. For a second, it seemed that the reflection was simply behind. But then she turned her head in the mirror, slightly earlier than she did in reality. She froze, motionless, without blinking. At that moment, the reflection also froze, but for a fraction of a second longer. At that moment, somewhere behind the wall, a switch clicked quietly. The next morning, she tried to explain everything rationally. Perhaps the old glass with its uneven coating was causing a phantom reflection, or perhaps the uneven surface was causing the light to linger, creating the illusion of movement. She wanted to believe that it was all related to physics. But a day later, the mirror showed more than physics could explain. She was getting ready for work, already standing at the door with her bag. The room looked the same in the reflection, except for one detail. There, in the depths, against the backdrop of the curtain, stood a figure. It was vague, with blurred features, like a human shadow. She turned around sharply. The room was empty. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind told her she had to check. She slowly approached the mirror and looked more closely. The figure was gone, but the feeling that someone had just been standing there did not go away. That night, she dreamed that the mirror was glowing from within. She stood in front of it, and her reflection moved slightly faster, smiling a fraction of a second earlier. In the morning, she remembered this with a heavy heart. The dream seemed to foreshadow something. When she returned in the evening, she noticed that the mirror seemed to be waiting for her. The room was silent. When she walked past it, her reflection stepped forward earlier, and this time, her reflected face trembled slightly, as if it wanted to say something. She came closer and suddenly noticed that the reflection lingered when she blinked. A moment later, the eyes in the mirror opened before she did, and then something flashed at the edge of her vision. In the background, in the reflected room, the door opened slightly. She froze, turned around. The door behind her was tightly closed. In the mirror, she could already see the door handle slowly turning. Reality lagged behind for a second. That second was enough for my heart to sink. When the handle in the mirror reached the end, there was a real click behind her in the real room. The click was quiet, but too clear to be confused with anything else. She turned around. The door was in place, the handle motionless. The room looked the same as always, only the air seemed denser, heavier. A coldness emanated from the mirror, barely perceptible, like glass lying on snow. She stood motionless, feeling the muscles in her back tense up. Finally, she approached the door and touched the handle. The metal was warm, as if someone had recently held it. Everything inside her contracted, but curiosity prevailed. She opened the door slightly. The hallway was empty. The darkness seemed ordinary, not threatening, and yet it felt as if someone was watching her from it. When she returned to the room, the mirror no longer reflected her completely. Part of the image seemed to have shifted. The top of the mirror remained lighter, as if another scene, slightly different from this one, continued there. Behind her, the reflection still showed the door half open. She had closed it. She decided to record everything on video. She turned on the camera, placed it on a tripod opposite the mirror, and stepped back. Her reflection was visible on the phone screen. Normal, motionless. Nothing happened for 5 minutes. Then, when she leaned toward the screen to stop recording, she noticed that her figure in the mirror remained motionless for another second after she left the frame. Viewing the video confirmed it. The reflection lingered, sometimes accelerating. No editing defects, no glare, just a strange asynchrony, elusive, like a metronome that had gone out of sync. She sent the recording to a physicist she knew from the institute, where she once worked as a lab assistant. He replied a couple of days later, "Perhaps the glass has an uneven coating, and the old amalgam composition reflects not light, but a static image." He advised not to touch it, and not to place heat sources nearby. But it wasn't a matter of physics. The next night, the mirror glowed softly, even though the lights in the room were off. In the reflection, she saw herself sitting on the bed, even though she was actually standing. And this her from the mirror raised her head and looked straight at her. At that moment, she understood. The reflection no longer repeats. It lives separately, a second ahead. She tried to cover the mirror with a cloth, but every morning when she woke up, she saw that the cloth had slipped down. Once she woke up from the feeling of being watched and found that the cloth was neatly folded on a chair. The mirror was clean, as if it had just been wiped. In the reflection, the light seemed like morning light, even though it was night outside the window. And in the background, behind her reflection, she could see someone walking past the door. She was afraid to turn around. Her whole body seemed to know that there was no one there, and that was precisely why she couldn't look. But the reflection moved, coming toward her. And at that moment, the mirror seemed to breathe. The glass curved slightly, like a membrane. She couldn't take it anymore. She threw a cup at the mirror. It didn't break. Only ripples spread across it, like on water. A second later, the surface became smooth again. The next day, her neighbor, an elderly woman from the apartment across the hall, came to visit her. She asked if she had heard a knock during the night. She said that water was dripping from the ceiling, but they couldn't find the source. The woman involuntarily looked at the mirror and said that she had seen something like this a long time ago. In pre-war apartments, where they put up predictive mirrors made not for beauty, but for observing time. She waved it off. But the neighbor added that her father was a restorer, and once mentioned that some mirrors remember light and then show not a reflection, but a trace. She didn't believe it, but the words stuck in her head. In the evening, a new discrepancy appeared in the reflection. There was a book on the nightstand, an old one with a black cover. She knew for sure that she had put it away in the closet. In the mirror, the book opened by itself, the pages turning as if by the wind. The room was quiet. She went to the closet. The book was indeed inside, but open to the same page as in the mirror. Every day, the mirror became more active. Sometimes, she noticed that the reflection changed position when she wasn't moving. Sometimes the objects in the mirror were arranged slightly differently. The chair was closer, the painting was higher, the light was softer. It was as if everything there was a little more perfect. At some point, it began to seem to her that the mirror was showing not just a second ahead, but another version of the room, a perfect, correct one. One evening, returning home, she noticed herself in the mirror standing in the hallway, even though she hadn't turned the key in the lock yet. In the reflection, she entered, took off her coat, and walked into the room. She stood outside, frozen, with the key in her hand. When she turned the key, there was no one inside. Her anxiety turned into obsession. She stopped seeing her friends, turned off the TV, and was afraid to even look at her phone. All her attention was focused on the mirror. It became the center of the apartment, a source of tense silence. Sometimes it seemed as if it was waiting for her gaze. When she approached it, the surface trembled slightly, as if it were alive. One night, she woke up to a strange sound, a quiet knock, as if someone had touched the glass from the inside. The mirror was opposite the bed. The light from the window fell directly on it, and the reflection of the room looked slightly brighter. A shadow moved at the edge of the glass, not hers. She looked. In the reflection, someone was standing at the door, motionless. She turned around. No one was there. She looked back at the mirror. The figure took a step forward. Her heart was pounding in her temples, but she couldn't look away. A second later, the figure was closer, and she realized she was looking at herself. Only her face was slightly different, her gaze colder, her breathing calm, like someone who already knows everything. The mirror image raised her hand and touched the glass from the inside. At that moment, there was a dry click from the mirror, like the crack of ice. She cried out, but did not have time to recoil. The surface trembled, and a quiet sound, like an exhalation, came from deep within. In the morning, the mirror looked the same, but a thin scratch appeared on its edge, as if from the inside. She decided to get rid of it. She called a mover, but he didn't show up. Then she tried to carry it out herself. She lifted the mirror, but it turned out to be unexpectedly heavy. as if someone were holding it from the other side. When she finally tore it off the wall, she saw an old label on the back: K Brothers Reflective Manufactory, and a batch number. The paper was fresh, as if it had been stuck on yesterday. She remembered that the market vendor had mentioned an old house. Perhaps it was from the apartment where he lived. She decided to find the address. In the evening, she found a reference to the house in the archives of the city newspaper. The building had been demolished after a fire in the 70s, and there were no survivors. Among the dead was a woman named Kolosova, the same surname as on the sticker. That night, she couldn't sleep. It seemed as if the mirror was whispering, not with words, but with a rustling sound, as if the wind were sliding across the glass. She tried not to listen, but the sounds formed a rhythm similar to breathing. At dawn, the mirror was covered with small cracks that ran from the inside out, as if something had awakened. In the reflection, the room looked the same, except the window was wide open. She went to the real window. It was closed. At that moment, a knock came from the mirror, exactly 3 times, like on a door. A minute later, there was a real knock on the door. The knock repeated itself, exactly 3 short taps, like a metronome. She looked through the peephole and saw an empty, dimly lit hallway, only the shadow of the railing and a dim lamp on the ceiling. In the mirror, the door was already ajar, and an oblong box tied with gray tape lay on the doormat. It looked like a delayed joke. In the reflection, the event had already happened, but in reality, it hadn't yet. She decided not to open the door and stood there for a whole minute, counting her heartbeats. Exactly 1 minute later, in reality, she heard footsteps coming up the stairs, breathing and the rustling of paper. Someone behind the door said they would leave the package and that she didn't need to sign for it. She didn't answer. The footsteps faded away. When she opened the door, there was indeed a box on the doormat, tied up, just like in the mirror. Her name was written on the form, but her maiden name was listed, the one she hadn't used in a long time. In the to field was the surname Kolosova, written by hand, neatly and confidently. She carried the box to the table. It was unexpectedly heavy, as if it contained not an object, but air compressed into a stone. The cardboard smelled of dampness and old printing ink. She cut the tape and carefully removed the lid. Inside was a wooden mirror backing with slots for fasteners, old newspapers between the layers, an envelope with a thin string, and a small metal key. On the inside of the backing, there were pencil marks, as if someone had been checking the dimensions of the wall. Arrows, distances, notes saying, "Empty here." On the edge was a burnt mark with the initials KK. She unfolded the newspapers, pieces of advertisements, notes about everyday incidents, a list of tenants in an apartment building. Between the pages was a photograph. A woman in a dark dress, her hair in a high ponytail, her hands on her knees. Her face was calm and familiar. as if she knew she was being photographed for posterity. On the back was a caption: Lida Kolosova, room by the window to the right of the stove. The features were disturbingly familiar, not just a resemblance, but the familiar position of the head, the crease at the lips, the gaze of someone who was used to listening more than talking. In the envelope was a receipt, an advance payment for the restoration of a carpentry workshop. The customer's surname, Kolosova, the address of an old house that no longer existed. There was also a key as thin as a hair with the number 3 on it. There were traces of green paint on the key. She remembered that she had a small painted cabinet in her kitchen with exactly the same old green paint inherited from her grandmother. There had always been a strange slit on the inside wall of this cabinet, as if for a miniature lock. She could never understand what it was for. She thought it was just a coincidence until she noticed in the mirror that the cabinet was already open in the reflection, and there was a key inside. In reality, it was closed. She was drawn to a simple thought: to check. She put the box down, went into the kitchen, and found a keyhole in the recess under the shelf, so small that it had previously seemed like a defect. The key fit perfectly and turned easily, as if it had been waiting for this all these years, and the shelf moved back a couple of millimeters, revealing a thin, narrow pocket in the wall. There was a folded note and a piece of mirror glass the size of a palm. The note was written in old handwriting. If you don't want to repeat it, don't ask the mirror what will happen. The note was signed by my grandmother. My grandmother's maiden name was Kolosova. She didn't immediately understand what it meant, but the connection became clear instantly. The mirror from the market came from the same house where her grandmother was born. The family had once lived there, and something had remained on the glass. She remembered how her grandmother sometimes said that the day can be seen from the evening, as if she knew in advance the little things that were about to happen. At the time, it seemed like experience. Now it seemed like a habit of talking to a reflection that responded to the immediate future. She returned to the room. The mirror reflected her with a delay of -1 minute. The very same piece of glass from the cabinet was already lying on the table, neatly inserted into the frame like a bookmark. In reality, she had the piece in her hand. She put it on the table and thought for the first time that she could use it to her advantage. If the mirror shows 1 minute ahead, you can check whether to let someone in, answer the phone, or peek under the door before someone knocks. It's like having a little shield for 60 seconds. The thought was dangerous because it gave her power. She decided to test it on something simple. She put the kettle on and glanced in the mirror. In the reflection, the water was already boiling and beginning to overflow. She returned to the stove and reduced the heat. When the water reached boiling point in reality, the kettle did not splash. Someone's minute had saved it. This was followed by a second thought. It is possible to notice something that has not yet entered the room. She set the camera to record and left the door to the hallway ajar. A minute later, a silhouette appeared in the doorway in the reflection. The height, shoulders, back of the head. not a boy, not an old man, someone of average height. She turned away, sat down on a stool, counted to 60 in reality, and heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone lingered at the door in the hallway, then left. It was easy to get caught up in this game. She began to catch the rhythm of the apartment, checking it against the mirror, like doctors check a pulse against monitors. A light bulb that would soon burn out, a doorbell that was about to ring, the sound of the elevator a minute before the car stopped on her floor. She quickly realized that the mirror was not wrong. And she also realized that being a minute ahead meant living not in the present, but in anticipation. The first consequences were almost funny. She stopped tripping over the rug because she could see it crumpling in the reflection. She took out her key on time because the reflection was already holding it in the other hand. She placed her cup further away from the edge of the table. But the inner cold did not go away. Along with useful little things, the mirror brought into the house a persistent feeling of someone else's presence. The neighbor came in again with questions about the nighttime noises and said she heard whispering, as if the radio in their wall was picking up a distant station. She replied that she didn't have a radio and added that it might be the ventilation. The neighbor looked around, paused at the mirror, and noticed that her headscarf was tied differently in the reflection. The neighbor smiled and said that the mirror was flattering because she looked younger in the reflection. Before leaving, she asked her not to open the door at night at the first knock, and told her that her father had observed something similar in a pre-war house in his youth. A mirror that got ahead of itself when the lights in the house were turned off exactly on schedule. That evening, she deliberately did not turn off the lights out of habit, to see if the mirror would obey or not. In the reflection, the light bulb went out with a quiet flash of light and a shadow on the wall. A minute later, in reality, the circuit breaker clicked in the fuse box, and the lights actually went out. She went out into the hallway, walked to the fuse box, and there on the door was a piece of paper with the maintenance schedule from the time when the wiring in the house was changed. At the bottom, someone else's handwriting added, "Night restart on Thursdays." Today was Thursday. She was alerted by the coincidence. The mirror was ahead of time, but sometimes it worked according to schedule. So it wasn't magic, but habits in the house. The elevator runs more often at night because the neighbor on the 5th floor comes home from work. The janitor wipes the dust off the handrails on certain days. The ventilation in the basement turns on by timer. If you put these rhythms together, you can guess what will happen in a minute without having a mirror. But the mirror still showed a little more. Someone else's shoulders behind the door. An open book she hadn't picked up yet. The text on the phone screen before it vibrated. She decided to conduct a mini investigation. She turned on the intercom recording on her laptop and looked through the call logs. She found empty lines with only times listed, as if someone had pressed the button for her apartment, but the recording did not record the number of the intercom. These events happened exactly when the silhouette appeared in the mirror behind the door. She wrote on a piece of paper, "Unexplained calls plus silhouette." Below that, she wrote, "Lead time, 1 minute." On the right, she wrote, "Thursdays, restart." She lay awake at night and thought that this logic had been devised by someone before her. It was as if the person who had used the mirror before her had already figured out the pattern and left clues. The key to the locker, a surname, a sticker with initials. In addition to the backing, there was a second envelope in the box. She opened it. Inside was a thin sheet of paper with handwritten instructions. To remove the mirror without returning, you need to put in another backing and fix the time. Below that was, "Time is not the hands of a clock, but breath." She read and did not understand. At the bottom was a note. "Tie the minute to yourself, otherwise the minute will tie you." That night, she finally decided to remove the mirror. She prepared a screwdriver, placed a new sheet of plywood nearby, choosing the right size, and connected the fasteners. Before she started, she looked at her reflection. In it, she was already holding the mirror in her hands. Removed from the wall, heavy, embraced with both hands, her fingers tense. Her gaze in the reflection was strange. Calm, but too calm. Like that of a person who had made a decision. And also, the eyes in the reflection looked like someone else's. Lighter, sharper, as if it was not her looking out, but someone looking out from within. That gaze burned. She turned to the real mirror. In reality, her eyes were tired and dark, as usual. In the reflection, they were pale, with a metallic sparkle. She took a step back, and the mirror stepped back a fraction of a second before her, maintaining the same distance. She realized she couldn't delay, otherwise the reflection would take control. She took a screwdriver, pried open the fasteners, and lifted the frame. At that moment, in the mirror, she was already standing at the door, with the mirror in her hands. Her reflected foot took a step. Her hand reached for the handle. In reality, she was standing in an empty room, just trying it out. The plan was simple. Remove it, cover it with a back panel, carry it to the stairs, and place it against the wall so she couldn't see it. But the mirror led her like a teacher who had already written the answer on the board. On her way to the door, she noticed that in the reflected room, there was a second envelope on the rug that had not been on the floor. Inside was an instruction. She knew that in advance. She stopped at the threshold and decided to play it safe. She placed the mirror directly opposite the door, so that the reflection showed the hallway. She looked. A minute later, she saw herself in the reflection in the doorway, the one who had already taken out the mirror and returned. The face in the reflection was slightly illuminated by the light from the entrance. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were unfamiliar. In reality, nothing had happened yet. She breathed slowly, counting to 60, and felt her muscles tense and her throat dry up. At the 40th second, someone stepped onto the stairs below. At the 50th, someone touched the railing. At the 55th, she heard the rustle of her own clothes. At the 60th, she really did appear in the doorway, returning without the mirror, and looked up. This second, she, in the reflection, looked straight ahead, with neither doubt nor fatigue in her eyes. This gaze conveyed a sense of completion, like that of a person who had already lived through this moment and brought something back from it. In reality, the rug was empty, but in the reflection, she was there, a stranger. Her heart skipped a beat. She suddenly realized that if she took the mirror out now, someone else would return in a minute. It didn't seem like a metaphor, but rather an everyday fact, almost as banal as an elevator schedule. Take it out, and you'll come back a different person. She approached the mirror closely, trying to suppress the trembling in her hands. In the reflection, the second her stood very close, and now she could see every detail. Her lips were slightly thinner, her gaze clearer, the scar above her eyebrow lighter than in reality, and a barely noticeable movement. It preceded her. The reflection raised her eyebrows, as if surprised. She told herself she wouldn't turn away. She nailed the new backing in place with short nails, as if covering someone else's painting. And at that moment, the mirror responded with a quiet, tense ringing, as if the glass had been slightly stretched. In the reflection, the second she stepped back, and shadows passed behind her. Not one, not two, several. She realized that she was not alone in this corridor, and not alone in this room. The minutes that belonged to different people lived their smooth lives in the glass. When someone wanted to close them, they moved like water into which a hand is dipped. There was another click from the switch. The light on the stairs changed. A key clinked in the box on the table, as if it had been carefully placed on the edge. She turned sharply. In reality, everything on the table was just as she had left it. In the reflection, the key flashed, and someone's hand, with slender fingers, put it in a coat pocket. She knew that gesture. Her grandmother did the same thing when she cleared small change from the table. Quickly, precisely, without a sound. She felt cold. There, in front of her for a moment, someone had taken advantage of what she hadn't had time to hide. She clenched a shard from the kitchen cabinet in her palm and remembered her grandmother's note. If you don't want to repeat it, don't ask the mirror what will happen. The decision came not from her mind, but from her habit of living without outside guidance. She told herself she would stop checking. She would take it off and leave without looking, as her future movements promised. She put on her jacket, took the mirror with both hands, feeling its unnecessary weight, and stepped toward the door, staring stubbornly at the floor like someone who doesn't want to see the sign ahead. In the reflection, the second she stopped, as if she did not expect her not to look her in the eye. They passed each other in a second, like people on a narrow staircase, and each remained in her own time. The hallway smelled of smoke, the same smoke that had drifted from the garbage chute on the very first evening. Distant voices could be heard on the stairs. She went down one flight, placed the mirror against the wall, and exhaled. In the reflection, she saw herself going back up, without the mirror, and thought that now it was over. But from the depths of the glass, another silhouette appeared. A woman, with her hair pulled back, wearing a simple dress. The silhouette walked past her as if she weren't there, stopped at the apartment door, and paused with her hand on the doorknob, as if about to knock. A minute later, there was a loud knock upstairs, clear and businesslike, like a postman's. She pushed herself away from the railing and got up, slower than she would have liked. A voice behind the door said it had brought official papers from the archives. A formal voice, devoid of emotion. She opened the door. On the doormat lay an envelope with an official seal. Inside was a copy of the pre-war house register, a list of residents, among whom was Lydia Kolosova. In the notes, it said, "Sister of Anna P." She knew this Anna only as a name in a family legend. It turned out that the woman in the photo was her great-grandmother's sister. The connection stretched across the years, not as a mysterious kinship, but as an ordinary paper record. The envelope was delivered by a young courier. He was short, thin, with a tired face. He explained that the archive asked to deliver it with a special mark, because someone had been looking for these same documents yesterday. She asked who. He said the surname was illegible, but the note had the letters KK on it. She thanked him. The courier looked around and suddenly asked if she needed help carrying out the old thing standing in the hallway. He noticed that the mirror was dangerous standing there. She was surprised by his simple thoughtfulness. Others in line might have laughed at him for his concern, but he turned out to be that unexpected benefactor, a person with modest resources who decided to move a heavy object with a small action. They went downstairs together. The courier said he had a strap and offered to tie the frame so it wouldn't slip. She agreed. She glanced in the mirror for a second and saw that a minute later, the strap was indeed holding the frame, and there was a shiny scratch on his wrist. She wanted to tell him to be careful, but remembered her decision, not to check. She told herself that she would trust him, as one trusts people when there is no one closer. He pulled, lifted, and noted that the glass seemed to pull back like rubber. She nodded. They took the mirror out into the yard. For a moment, it seemed to her that the air had become lighter. The courier said he had gloves and suggested waiting for the garbage truck to give the frame away as bulky waste. She nodded again. He stayed by the entrance and began filling out the delivery note on his scanner, a small screen flashing green. She went upstairs to get the box with the backing and documents. The mirror left in the yard reflected the light from her apartment window, even and quiet, like a lamp left on for those who come home late. As she climbed, she heard the elevator stop between floors. The doors opened and closed without a sound. In the mirror at the turn of the staircase, she saw a flash of movement. Someone entered the elevator with the mirror under their arm. In reality, she was alone. She stopped and looked up at the landing. The mirror by the courtyard was still in place. The courier was nearby, but his silhouette in the reflection was already in the elevator. Exactly 1 minute earlier. She didn't run or scream. She just pressed the envelope to her chest like a shield. And she thought that it wasn't just her reflection moving forward. Strangers were moving forward too. Those who had already used this glass, and even the habits of home, the elevator, the garbage chute, the switchboard. Everything lives a minute earlier. At home, she put the documents on the table. The list of residents, stickers, receipts. In the building logbook, they found a pencil note written by someone else. Don't look in the mirror in the hallway every evening. Next to it were the initials AP. That same Anna from the family tree. She didn't yet know who she was, but she felt a connection like a weight on her collarbone. Not mysterious, but heavy, like a family wardrobe that cannot be thrown away. At night, she woke up from the silence. It was so thick that she could hear not a sound, but the absence of sound. Nothing illuminated the mirror in the courtyard, but she could see it as one sees objects in a dream, clearly as if it were nearby. A faint light flickered inside the glass, like a pulse. She knew that there was a person standing in the courtyard who had not yet arrived, and that in a minute there would be another knock at the door. And sure enough, 3 short knocks, businesslike, cautious. She got up, went over, and this time opened the door right away. There was a second box on the doormat. The label had her new last name, but her old address, with a note saying, "Back replacement, for storage." Inside was a thin sheet of glass and a note, no longer smudged, with neat handwriting. "If you want the mirror to stop watching you, leave 1 minute empty." At the bottom was an explanation. Do nothing for 1 minute when the mirror calls. She smiled for the first time, briefly, bitterly. It sounded like a joke. How could she spend a minute in a house that lived on a future breath? But that, perhaps, was the only move. Not to feed the system with a new second. She placed a stool by the door, sat down, set the kitchen timer for 1 minute, and placed it on her lap. In the mirror, now hanging on the stairs, she had already gotten up, walked to the table, picked up the phone, and answered a call that had not yet come. She turned away from the mirror, stared at the white wall, counting her heartbeats, listening to the hum of the battery throughout the house, and did not move. The timer was silent for a long time. The readings seemed to freeze, but the hand finally reached the end and clicked briefly. A minute passed, and there was no call or knock. The reflection in the mirror remained empty, a strange feeling, as if a dark slit had appeared there forever. She thought it had worked, but any emptiness has a habit of filling itself with whatever has more patience. A female figure appeared in the reflected emptiness, as slowly as patterns appear on glass from breath. She recognized the face, the one from the photograph. Lida Kolosova, her great-grandmother's sister, the one whose initials were on the brand. The woman in the reflection made no gestures. She simply was. This being pushed the room back a step, and suddenly it became clear. Sometimes a mirror does not predict, but remembers. It remembers the habits of the domestic world: open windows, knocking on the door, lights turning on at night, footsteps on the stairs, and brings them out into the open. Everything that is similar connects. Family resemblance is also a habit that glass easily binds together. She thought she had a choice, but the choice turned out to be different. Not to look at the moment when it was really necessary. And it was the hardest moment to do nothing. The door slammed shut from the draft, like a sign. The ventilation in the stairwell switched on. Somewhere below, the elevator hit the rails, a tired sound of metal against metal. Her back appeared in the mirror on the staircase. She was going down with the mirror in her hands. In reality, she sat motionless. And for the first time, the two versions of her diverged for more than a minute. The one who had already managed to take it out and bring it back appeared in front of her, and now looked at her as if she were slow. Her gaze was steady, cold, without malice, but without warmth. It showed the fatigue of those who have lived too long in the habit of looking ahead to the next second. She realized that the real task was not to endure or break apart. The real task was to tear apart the everyday seam between now and in a minute, to leave the house with its timers and herself with a pause. She sat, and everything entered that pause. The smell of burning from the playground, the rustle of paper in boxes, the initials on the backdrop, her grandmother's note, the surname in the house register, the stair steps, a stranger's courier belt, which actually left a small scratch on her wrist when he pulled the frame. Her own habits also entered, adjusting her scarf, placing her cup closer to the edge, listening to the elevator before going to sleep. The pause held, but the mirror did not give up. Deep within the reflection, rooms began to light up one after another, as if someone had walked through the house, flipping light switches. In each room, the reflections moved as in old movies. People got up, put down a book, turned off the radio, opened a window. In each one, exactly 1 minute earlier. Among them, she flashed by, in a different jacket, with a different hairstyle, with unfamiliar eyes. The ones that looked at her when she first saw herself, ahead of time. Her flash was not a gesture, but an intention. That was enough to understand. The last step would have to be taken anyway. She took the box with the backdrop and went down to the courtyard, where the courier was waiting for the garbage truck. He said he was ready to help carry it to the container. She suggested leaving the mirror under the canopy and taking the documents herself. He nodded and said he would be back in a minute because he had to sign with the dispatcher. She thought that even his absence for a minute would be enough for the mirror to switch places between "see you later" and "goodbye." The courtyard was quiet, and she could hear the car, which had not yet turned onto their street, already humming in the reflection of the entrance window. She stopped in front of the mirror, leaned her palm against the frame, and told herself that she would look one last time, to know that she had not been mistaken. In the reflection, she stood differently, her shoulders straighter, her mouth tighter, her eyes the same, unfamiliar, calm. The reflection did not have a box in one hand, and the other touched her collarbone out of habit, as it did when she was nervous. This movement, repeated throughout her life, was the thread by which the mirror recognized her among others. 1 second, 2. A minute is enough for any promise to oneself to be broken. She stepped back, deciding she wouldn't look anymore. And then the janitor came around the corner from below. The same unassuming man who went unnoticed in the stairwell, nod for nod. He said he had seen her carrying the frames out, and that he had some old plywood. Without looking, he suggested simply covering the back and clamping the mirror so that it would become ordinary. like all the others. He said he had done this once before in another house, where people were tormented by the glare. She didn't know whether to believe him. But it was his hands, rough and confident, that turned out to be the hidden craftsmanship against status that decides such stories. He didn't know the words for amalgam and minute loops. He just knew how to hammer a nail so that the wood wouldn't crack, and how to lower the frames on their edges so that the glass wouldn't crack. They held the back together. He said he wouldn't look at the glass. She didn't look either. They did simple work and talked about simple things. How it's better not to iron old things against the grain. He asked her to bring another nail. She left for a couple of breaths. When she returned, she couldn't find him. His cap lay nearby, neatly folded. On the frame was the perfectly fitted back. In the mirror, whether it stood in the sun or in the shade, now only she was reflected at that very moment. On the side of the frame was a barely noticeable scratch in the shape of the letter D, like a detail left by a hand that not everyone would notice. The underappreciated hero left without asking for thanks. She thought she was done. She turned the mirror toward the wall, turned toward the house, and through the window glass saw herself entering the room without a mirror and approaching the hallway. Her eyes no longer had their former cold calm. They were dull, like those of a person who is not sure they are still themselves. The way upstairs took less than a minute. The landing smelled of burning, faintly, as on the very first day. The mirror in the hallway had been removed. There was a lighter spot on the wall. The room was silent, and she could hear the house watching over itself. The elevator breathed in the shaft. The doors of the rare neighbors whispered in the vestibule. The radiators redistributed heat. She put the housebook on the shelf, her grandmother's note in the cabinet, and the key in the same place. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand whether this moment belonged to her. The courtyard below the mirror was empty. In the reflection, it still lived with its own light. Old glass gives off what it has accumulated for a long time. She felt that history does not like abrupt endings. In such matters, a break is not a dash, but an ellipsis. A dry click came from the hallway. She knew that sound. The switch had restarted. In the mirror, memory below, the janitor put his cap back on his head and disappeared around the corner. The courier put his belt on his bag and walked to the car, looking back as if he had forgotten something simple at the last moment, like smiling. The room went dark. She got up and found the light switch by touch. The light came on with a delay. And at that moment, those very eyes flashed in the reflective glass facade of the wardrobe. Not hers. These eyes, someone else's, were no longer from the mirror a minute ahead, but from her very self, who had held on to the signs for too long instead of breathing at her own pace. She told herself that she would live without hints, that she would try for at least a day. But she already knew. A house in which a mirror appears remembers not the object, but the habit of looking at what will be. And habit is a stubborn thing. There was a quiet knock at the door. Exactly 3 times. She didn't go to the door. She sat down on a stool, put her palms on her knees, closed her eyes, and lived that moment in emptiness. The knocker paused and left. The mirror, standing in the courtyard facing the wall, reflected only the brickwork. It seemed to her that it had finally become quieter. She did not know that in a minute, a shadow would appear behind the door again, and then again in another minute. And many minutes later, on different days, the house lives in repetitions, like an elevator on a schedule. She knew only one thing. At any such moment, she could do nothing. And perhaps that was the only justice available to her. Not to defeat the mirror, but to stop being its future. Where there used to be a crack in the old glass, there was now an empty wall. On it, a stain the color of time faded into an oval shape. Her neighbor said that emptiness also reflects. She agreed and said that emptiness perhaps reflects more honestly. The next day, the intercom log contained empty lines with no numbers, only the time. She added one word to them in pencil. Waited out. There were no more entries in the call column. The camera feeds showed empty stairwells. She didn't know that this wasn't the end, but she knew that now she could endure the pause. And the pause, as someone had written on the back of the mirror, is breathing, if you breathe your own breath. In the morning, she checked the door for the usual details. The chain was on the hook, the mat was slightly shifted, and there was nothing underneath it. There were envelopes on the table, a copy of the house register, receipts, pencil notes, saying night restart, and waited out. A jacket hung on the back of a chair. In the pocket was a key with the number 3 on it, cold and thin as a needle. Downstairs in the courtyard, against the wall, stood a mirror with a new backing. Tightly nailed, smooth, with a barely noticeable notch in the shape of a letter that only the janitor could have left. She felt a slight sense of support from the very thought that someone invisible had done the job better than any craftsman from the catalog. The unsung hero, whom no one in this house was accustomed to thanking, had already resolutely gone to his buckets and keys, leaving behind a quiet victory. A notification from the archive flashed on her phone. An employee wrote that he had seen her request, matched the sticker with the K Brothers workshop, and was ready to come, draw up a report, and take the item into storage as a family heirloom with documentary significance. He added that they had a wooden box with soft corners and light-proof fabric. It seemed like a rare stroke of luck. An outsider with real resources could, with a single decision, remove the item from the house without a scandal with the authorities, without arguments with neighbors, and without unnecessary explanations. She thought that this was exactly the intervention she had been waiting for. Not a miracle, but simple bureaucracy that knew how to close strange stories with a stamp and a delivery note. She replied that she would be home. She turned her phone screen down so she wouldn't see any flashes. There were still a few hours left before his arrival. That was enough time to ruin everything, and enough to end everything. She put on her gloves and went down to the yard. The air was clear, as if after a night rain, although it hadn't rained. The mirror stood half-turned against the wall, and a piece of the yard was reflected in its depths. Trash cans, tree crowns, the wall of the neighboring house, rough brick. No mysticism, just an object and light. But she knew that inside, a minute's worth of the future was still accumulating. The trash can door would lift. A cat would run across the path. Someone's footsteps would strike the metal, and the mirror would show it first. She turned it to face the wall. The metal frame cracked like a dry branch. At that moment, the janitor came out from below and nodded. He said he had fixed the back panel evenly, as he had been taught, so that it would hold if he didn't poke it with a sharp object. He added that it could be propped up on its side so that it wouldn't slide, and that it was better to cover it from the sun until it was taken away. There was indeed a fresh scratch across his wrist in his jacket pocket, the very one she had seen a minute earlier, and this made the prediction inexpensive and realistic. Only wounds earned through labor are predicted in this house. She thanked him. He waved her off and said they had to hurry because the garbage truck would come tomorrow, not today. It sounded like a reminder of the rhythm she would have to get into without a mirror. Not guessing, but knowing the schedule. At home, she put everything related to the mirror into a folder. A photograph of Lida Kolosova, a copy of the house register, her grandmother's note, receipts, and ribbons. She put the small shard from the cabinet in a separate place. The piece of glass lay heavy in her palm, like a pebble from a familiar path. She thought that keeping it meant preserving a loophole. But throwing it away meant cutting the thread that held on to a warm understanding. Her family did not begin with a legend, but with people who lived in a house with a stove and paid for their accommodation with blue bills. With a woman whose movements resembled her own. She did what her grandmother had taught her without any notes. She put the fragment in an envelope and signed a couple of words. Her surname and locker. It was not magic, but order. The archivist arrived around noon. He was a short, thin man with a briefcase and a wooden box with straps. He said that he didn't like to discuss strange things over the phone, that he preferred to see things with his own eyes, draw up a report, and take them away immediately. He asked if she had proof of kinship, and she showed him a copy of the house register issued yesterday. The surname Kolosova, in the same line as the name that matched her great-grandmother's, and a note about her sister. He nodded and added dryly that this was sufficient for a family legend, which the archive considers appropriate for labeling storage. He did not promise that the item would be put on display. He said that the task of the archive was to transfer responsibility from people to papers. It was said without pride, as a fact that can save lives today. They went down to the courtyard. The janitor had already placed the lost piece of plywood under the frame and tied it to the pipe with string. The archivist took out a black cloth and suggested covering the glass without looking at it too much, so as not to create the effect of the last frame. She helped hold it while he tied the straps. He said that in such cases, it was better not to linger on the reflection, because the eye remembers the light and begins to search for it. He repeated this calmly without mystery. When the mirror was placed in the box and the straps clicked, it seemed to her that the yard had become wider. No pop, no draft. Just the feeling of a momentary pull disappeared, as if the house had returned her breath to its normal length. The archivist lifted one end of the box and asked for help with the other. He noticed that the back was nailed down skillfully. He said that someone had a good feel for wood. She replied that the janitor had done it. The archivist nodded and added that he would sign him in the document as assistant if he didn't mind. There was a small restoration of justice in this. The name of a man who was not called a master would appear on a piece of paper next to the seal. They carried the box to the car. The archivist opened the tailgate and said that now the mirror would become not a dangerous thing in the house, but an item of record. He added that it would no longer be part of her everyday life. He said that if she felt that the silence in the apartment was still felt with a delay, it would be worth living for a few days without any reflective surfaces. Closing the wardrobe with glass doors, removing shiny panels, hanging a regular cloth on a nail. He said this like a doctor giving simple instructions. She came home and did just that. She covered the glass front of the wardrobe with an old sheet, removed the shiny lid from the kettle, and placed the phone face down. A light oval remained on the wall in the hallway, like an empty space from an old photograph. She looked at it, and for the first time, saw herself not through the eyes of the mirror, but through an inner sense of the layout of the room, where the window was, where the table was, where the door was. Nothing joyful, just a calm awareness. In the evening, her neighbor came in again. She asked if it would be too late to sign for yesterday's package. She looked at her neighbor and noticed that she looked younger in the empty wall than she did in the mirror. The neighbor said that she had seen a man with a box in the courtyard and that it had become easier to breathe on the landing. She didn't know why. She shrugged and said that sometimes houses give back air when something is taken out of them. At night, the house breathed evenly. No extra clicks, no mysterious footsteps. In the morning, the intercom showed several empty lines with the time and no numbers. She signed one with a pencil, held out for a minute. It was not a report or a request, just a personal note. It was an ordinary day, and there was nothing to reflect on. She worked, cooked, and folded clothes into boxes. She thought about those she had seen on paper, about Lida Kolosova, about her great-grandmother, about how people leave traces not only in mirrors, but also in books, in marks, in plywood backs, in couriers' belts, in scratches, on the janitor's hand, in a series of shield restarts on Thursdays. All of this together formed a myth that did not claim to be supernatural. It was simply that a habit at home coincided with a family habit, and the object preserved this shared moment like a splinter. Towards evening, a letter arrived from the archive. The archivist reported that he had accepted the item and issued a storage number. He added that on the inside of the frame, under the backing, he had found another sticker hidden under a layer of paper. A surname that matched her grandmother's maiden name, and a date that confirmed their connection. He wrote that, In his experience, it was better to leave such things alone, and that they are rarely exhibited in museums because they are quiet, not spectacular. He said that if she needed it, he would send a copy of the document. She closed the letter, and she realized that now she had what she needed, not an explanation, but a boundary. The thing was there. The house was here. She was in between. She lived through another day as a test. She deliberately avoided looking at the screen when the notification came. She left a minute empty if the familiar movement continued. But closer to nightfall, she caught the familiar feeling of delay. Not illness, not fear, but a slight shift in the edges of the room, as if something glass had been hung in the corner again. She walked into the hallway. The light oval on the wall had become very pale, but its shape was still visible. The emptiness reflected exactly what was in front of her: the wall and silence. She came closer and saw the shadow of an oval in the deepest layer of paint. It wasn't glass, but a trace. But traces sometimes get ahead too. She stood silently, living that very moment. The elevator below gently moved the cabin to another floor. A door closed somewhere, and a heating pipe creaked under the ceiling. At that moment, there was one imperceptible event. Her own face appeared before her eyes, without glass, without the eyes of others. Ordinary. The crease at the corner of her lips, which the mirror had once corrected, was now in place. She accepted it as part of herself. This was the quiet catharsis that is not shown on camera. A day later, the courier arrived, the same thin one. He brought a receipt for sending the documents to the archive. He said he had forgotten to ask for a signature, and also said that he had seen a light at the entrance at night, like a reflection. He smiled and added that it was probably the janitor who had turned on the light. She nodded and signed. He left, leaving a faint mark from his belt on the doormat. A simple thing from a simple man. That night, she heard the knocking again. 3 neat knocks. She didn't go. She sat and counted her breaths, as her own rule taught her. After a minute, the knocking did not repeat. She fell asleep. In the morning, she saw a thin envelope with no return address on the mailbox. Inside was a small piece of glass. Not the one she had packed, but another one. Attached to the shard was a note. Do not keep. Do not break. Survive. The handwriting was neither her grandmother's nor the archivist's. She thought it might have been left by the janitor, who had seen too much, or someone from the collection of household benefactors who knew how to do what was necessary without being asked. She went out into the yard with the shard. The janitor was digging the ground near a small tree. He said that it was better to add soil to the roots at this time of year. She asked him if he had left the envelope. He waved his hand as if it didn't matter. She held out the shard and said she didn't want it to stay with her, because little things like this could become a habit again. He nodded, took a hammer with a blunt end, wrapped the shard in a coarse rag, and struck it once, so that the glass would not scatter, but settle. Then he wrapped it more tightly and dropped the bundle into a trash can. covering it with another rag. No clinking, no shards. Just a simple period at the end of a line. She told him that his name had been added to the record. He was embarrassed and replied that it wasn't necessary, but his eyes lit up. He rarely received anything in writing. Now he had. The house lived according to its schedule. On Thursdays, the switch clicked at the appointed time. The elevator arrived when it was called. The intercom sometimes gave blank lines. Probably someone pressed the wrong button. It was no longer a sign or an omen, but simply statistics. She started wearing a watch on her wrist and noticed that she was living by it again, rather than by the reflection in the glass. A few weeks later, the archive sent her a photo. A mirror in a box, on straps, with a sticker and a number. At the bottom was a dry statement. Accepted for storage. Condition satisfactory. Backing reinforced. The archivist added that sometimes things in the archives quietly warm up and cool down, and that's okay. He wished her to breathe her own air. She closed the letter and looked at the empty oval on the wall. She put her palm against the paint. The wall was warm. She thought not about mysteries, but about the fact that now she would have to endure 1 minute every evening, the very minute she had given to the mirror. That minute would belong to no one. Nothing would happen in it. Her decision would live in it. In the evening, her neighbor brought her a jar of jam and said that the stairwell had become somehow lighter. She added that the maintenance crew had finally changed the light bulb and that the smell of burning had disappeared. She said she had dreamed of a young woman with her hair pulled up high, who looked at her without anxiety. She did not explain her dreams. She just nodded and thanked her. The house had gotten used to the new rhythm. So had she. Sometimes her hand would reach for the empty wall. Habit was stronger. She would stop her hand and hold it there for a minute. In that minute, there were no predictions, only breathing. And that simple minute turned out to be more accurate than any mysticism. Because the outcome was finally determined, not by glass, not by the house, and not by the eyes of strangers in the reflection, but by her decision not to look where everything was already prepared for her. Below, by the wall where the mirror had stood, a thin, even circle stretched across the green grass, the imprint of the box. The janitor had cut it off when he mowed the lawn, and this round, flattened strip disappeared. Just as any trace disappears if it is not fed with attention. The empty oval on the wall continued to fade. Someday it would blend in with the paint. For now it was a reminder not of a mystery, but of a solution. That was enough.